The call came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in January. I know the exact time because I was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, going through some old photos I'd pulled out of a box in the closet. My wife passed 4 years ago. January is hard. I keep the photos out more in January. My phone lit up and I saw it was my dad. My dad is 81 years old. He lives alone in the house he and my mother bought in 1974, out on the edge of Coburg, about 20 minutes from where I live now. He's sharp as a tack, my dad. Still does the crossword every morning. Still shovels his own front walk when the snow comes, even though I've told him 100 times to let me handle it. He's that kind of man. Doesn't ask for much, doesn't complain. So when he calls me close to midnight in January, I pick up before the second ring. Dad, you okay? His voice was different. That's the only way I can describe it. My dad has this steady, low voice. Been the same my whole life. But that night it was thinner somehow, like something had gone out of it. I think I need to go to the hospital, he said. My chest. It's been tight since this afternoon, and now my left arm's been going numb on and off for about an hour. I was already standing up from the table. Don't move, I'm coming. You don't have to. Dad, don't move. I hung up and grabbed my coat off the hook by the door. Then I reached for my keys and felt nothing. I checked my jacket pocket, checked the counter. Then I remembered, my truck was at my brother-in-law's garage. I'd dropped it off 2 days earlier for brake work and a transmission issue he'd been helping me diagnose. He runs a small auto shop out of a converted barn on his property about 40 minutes north of town. Good mechanic. Family discount. I'd been driving a loaner he lent me, a beater half-ton with a dead heater and bald tires, but that was sitting at my place in pieces because he'd started swapping out the wheel bearings that morning and hadn't finished. I stood in my kitchen for about 4 seconds and did the math. My daughter and her husband lived 12 minutes away. I called my daughter first, no answer. I tried again, voicemail. I left a message that I'm sure sounded calm but wasn't. Then I called my son-in-law. He picked up on the third ring groggy. I could tell I'd woken him up. Hey, I said, I'm sorry to call this late. My dad just phoned. He thinks he might be having a cardiac event. I don't have a vehicle tonight. Is there any chance I can borrow yours? Just to get him to the hospital. I'll bring it straight back. There was a pause. Which hospital? Northumberland. It's 20 minutes there, 20 back. Hour tops. Another pause. Longer this time. We've only got the one car right now, he said. Vanessa needs it in the morning. She's got that thing. I didn't say anything for a moment. My dad might be having a heart attack, I said. I know. Can't you call an ambulance? I can. But my dad is terrified of ambulances. He watched his brother get loaded into one 30 years ago, and his brother didn't come back. Every time I've mentioned it since he shuts down completely. I know it sounds irrational, but he's 81, and I'd rather not put him through that if I can help it. Okay, but we're sleeping, and if Vanessa needs the car in the morning, I'll have it back before 6 a.m., I promise. Yeah, I don't know, man. Call a cab or Uber. They run at night. And that was it? That was the answer. Not yes, not I'll bring it over right now, not of course, let me throw on my shoes. Just call a cab. Okay, I said. I don't know why I said okay. I think I just didn't have room in me at that moment for an argument. My dad was sitting alone in a house 20 minutes away with a tight chest and a numb arm, and I wasn't going to spend the next 10 minutes on the phone explaining to my son-in-law why this mattered. I said okay, and I hung up, and I called a cab. The dispatcher told me 15 to 20 minutes. I called my dad back and told him I was on my way, I just had a small delay. He said he was fine. He didn't sound fine. The cab took 22 minutes. I spent those 22 minutes at the kitchen table again, not looking at the photos anymore, just watching the clock on the microwave. At one point I tried my daughter again. Still no answer. I thought about calling my son-in-law back and telling him exactly what I thought of his answer. But I didn't. That wasn't the moment. My dad needed me to be moving in the right direction, not burning energy in the wrong one. The cab driver was a young guy, couldn't have been more than 25. His name was something I didn't catch, because I was already talking the second I got in. My dad's having chest pains. I need to get to Pemberton Road fast, please. He didn't ask questions. He just drove. I'll remember that. My dad was sitting on the front steps when we pulled up. In January. In his coat and boots, sitting on the icy front steps of his house at 12:30 in the morning because he didn't want to slow me down by making me come inside and find him. 81 years old, sitting on his front steps in the dark. I helped him into the cab and sat beside him and put my arm around him, and he let me, which told me more than his voice had. My dad is not a man who leans on people. He's been standing on his own since before I was born. When he let me put my arm around him, I knew he was scared. You're going to be fine, I said. Probably just indigestion, he said. Probably, I said. It wasn't indigestion. The ER at Northumberland was quiet that night, the way hospitals are quiet at 1 in the morning. Not empty, just stilled, everything moving at a different pace than the world outside. They took my dad in almost immediately when I described his symptoms. A nurse with a calm voice and quick hands got him hooked up to an ECG before I'd even finished the intake paperwork. I sat in a plastic chair in the waiting area and I waited. The chair was orange, one of those molded plastic ones that are shaped like they were designed for a body type that doesn't exist. There was a television mounted up near the ceiling, playing a home renovation show on mute, the subtitles running about 3 seconds behind whatever was being said. I didn't watch it. I just sat there with my coat in my lap and looked at the floor and thought about my son-in-law's voice saying, "Call a cab." A man across the room was asleep with his chin on his chest. A woman 2 seats down was knitting, the needles clicking in a soft, steady rhythm that was almost comforting. I got a coffee from the machine near the window. It cost $2.50 and tasted like hot cardboard, but I drank the whole thing. At some point I realized I hadn't eaten dinner. I couldn't remember why. I think I'd been planning to eat later and later had never come. Just before 2 in the morning, my daughter called back. She'd seen the missed calls and the voicemail, and her voice was immediately tight with worry. I told her where we were and what was happening, and she said she was on her way. I told her not to wake the kids. She said she was already in the car. She arrived 20 minutes later, still in her pajamas under her coat, her hair not brushed. She sat down next to me and took my hand without saying anything, and we just sat there together for a while. "I tried to call you and Lawrence earlier," I said eventually. "I know. I saw. My phone was on silent." "I'm so sorry, Dad," Lawrence answered, I said. She looked at me. I didn't say anything else about it right then. I just squeezed her hand and we went back to watching the door where they'd taken my dad. The doctor came out around 2:45. She was younger than I expected, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she spoke in that careful way that doctors have when they're giving you information, and also watching to see how much you can absorb. My dad had had what she called a NSTEMI, a non-SD elevation myocardial infarction, a type of heart attack. One of his coronary arteries was partially blocked. They were going to keep him and do an angioplasty in the morning. She expected him to recover well. These things, caught when they were caught, had good outcomes. I thanked her. I sat back down. My daughter cried a little, quietly, and then pulled herself together the way she always has since she was a kid. She's got her mother's composure. I've always been grateful for that. They let me see him for a few minutes around 3. He was in a hospital bed with tubes and monitors and the thin paper gown that makes everyone look smaller than they are. But his eyes were clear, and he looked at me when I walked in. "Told you it wasn't indigestion," I said. "You told me probably," he said. I sat down beside him and we talked for a little while. Not about much. About the house, about the winter, about a documentary he'd been watching about the building of the Confederation Bridge. He asked how my truck was coming along. I told him almost done. Before I left, he looked at me and said, "How'd you get here tonight?" "I thought your truck was in the shop." "Cab," I said. He nodded slowly. He didn't ask why. I think he understood more than I said. My daughter drove me home around 4:30. The streets were empty and the snow was blowing sideways off the lake. She kept both hands on the wheel and didn't push the conversation. But somewhere on the bypass she said quietly, "Lawrence didn't lend you the car, did he?" It wasn't really a question. It was late, I said. He was half asleep. "Dad, it's fine." She didn't say anything for the rest of the drive, but the set of her jaw said enough. My dad had the angioplasty the next morning. It went well. By Thursday he was sitting up and complaining about the food, which meant he was going to be okay. My brother-in-law had my truck ready by Wednesday evening and called to say he'd drop it off, which I found interesting timing. I didn't comment on it. I said thanks and that I'd pick it up Friday. My daughter didn't say much to Lawrence about that night, at least not right away. But she told me later that she'd asked him about it. Calmly, she said. She'd asked calmly. And his answer was that he'd been half asleep and not thinking straight, that of course he would have lent me the car if he'd understood how serious it was. I thought about that for a while. He'd understood. I'd told him the words. My dad might be having a cardiac event. I said those exact words. I don't think being half asleep means you can't understand those words. But I let it go. or I tried to. The thing about trying to let something go is that it doesn't always go. What kept coming back to me in the days after wasn't even the night itself, as hard as it was. It was something that happened about 2 weeks later. I'd been to see my dad. He was home by then, doing well, on new medications and strict orders from the cardiologist to take it easy and let people help him. My daughter and I had been taking turns checking in. I'd been over to fix a leaking faucet and put some better weather stripping on his back door, and on my way out my dad stopped me in the front hallway. "I need to tell you something," he said. He's a man of very few dramatic statements. I could count on one hand the times in my life he's said that. I stopped and turned around. "I was going to wait until spring," he said. "But I don't think I want to wait anymore." He told me he'd spoken to a lawyer. Not recently. He'd done it back in October, before the heart attack, just as a matter of getting his affairs in order the way responsible people do when they're in their 80s and living alone. He'd been thinking about what to do with the house, with the rest of what he'd managed to save over his lifetime, and he'd made some decisions. He didn't go into every detail, and I didn't ask him to. But he told me the shape of it. He was splitting things fairly between the people who had actually shown up in his life. He used that phrase, showed up. He said he'd been paying attention for a long time, and he knew who drove him to his appointments, who called on Sundays, who fixed the leaky faucet and shoveled the walk when he wasn't looking. He said he was adjusting things accordingly. He looked at me the whole time he said it. I told him it didn't matter. I meant it. He said, "It matters to me." I drove home thinking about the kind of man my father is. The kind of man who sits on his own front steps in January at midnight, so he won't slow his son down. The kind of man who does his own crossword and shovels his own walk and doesn't complain, and who has also been watching, quietly, with those clear eyes of his, for longer than anyone realized. About a week after that, my son-in-law called me. He was friendly. Almost too friendly, that particular warmth that comes on when someone is about to bring something up that they've been told about and aren't sure how to handle. He asked how my dad was doing, said he was really glad it had turned out okay, said it must have been a scary night. "It was," I said. "I feel bad about that night," he said. "That I didn't, I should have just said yes. I wasn't thinking clearly." "I know," I said. "I just want you to know I would have if I'd understood Lawrence," I said. "You told me to call a cab. I called a cab. My dad's okay. Let's leave it there." There was a pause. "Is there something, has Vanessa said something about the estate, or?" And that's where I understood what the phone call was actually about. He'd found out. Not from me, not from my daughter, but somehow he'd found out that my dad had spoken to a lawyer, that things were being restructured, and suddenly the midnight call I'd made in January was relevant in a new way. Suddenly it was worth a conversation. "I don't know anything about my dad's estate," I said, which was true. I knew what he'd told me in the hallway, and that wasn't much. I just meant, "I know what you meant," I said. "I really do." I kept my voice even. I wasn't cold. I wasn't angry. I was just done explaining. "My dad is doing well," I said. "That's what matters. Have a good evening." And I hung up. My daughter called me that night. She asked if Lawrence had called me. I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry, Dad. I don't know how he found out." "It doesn't matter," I said. "Your dad's fine. That's what matters. You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." She laughed a little at that, the way she does, low and short. Her mother's laugh. We talked for a while about my dad, about his next cardiology appointment, about the meals we were taking turns dropping off. She mentioned she'd signed him up for a service through the Coburg Seniors Center that does check-in calls on days when neither of us can make it out. $20 a month. He'd apparently complained about it until the woman who called introduced herself as a retired school teacher, and they ended up talking for 45 minutes about the education system. Before she hung up, she said, "I'm sorry I didn't pick up that night." "You didn't know," I said. "I know. But still, next time leave your ringer on," I said. "Next time," she said. "There better not be a next time." "Yeah," I said. "Let's hope." The angioplasty went so well that by March my dad was back at his kitchen table doing the crossword every morning. I know because I stopped in one Saturday, and he was there with his pen. Not pencil, he's always done it in pen. And the paper folded in half the way he's done it since the 70s. A mug of tea going cold beside him, because he gets absorbed and forgets to drink it. He looked up when I came in and said, 8 letters, faithful. Ends in a loyal, I said. He looked at it, wrote it in. "So it is," he said. I made us both fresh tea, and we sat in the kitchen for an hour. He showed me an article he'd cut out about the changing shoreline along Lake Ontario. We talked about the ice this year, about whether the summer would be as hot as last year, about a cousin of mine who was coming to visit in July. Small things. The things that make up most of a life. At one point he said, without looking up from the paper, "You never told me who lent you the car that night." "No one," I said. "I told you, Cab." He was quiet. "Nobody lent you a car," he said. "No." He nodded once, very slowly, set down his pen. "All right," he said. "That was all right." As if something had been confirmed that he'd already known. We finished our tea. I fixed the hinge on his back gate that had been stiff since fall. I shoveled the last of a late March snowfall off his steps, even though he told me he'd get it later. On my way out, he stood in the doorway, the way he always does, watching me go. "Drive safe," he said. "Always," I said. I sat in the truck for a moment before I started it, looking at the house. At the front steps where I'd found him in January, sitting in the cold so he wouldn't slow me down. At the light on in the kitchen where he'd go back to his crossword. Some things you can't put a number on. Some things you can't balance out with a phone call or a friendly conversation or a sudden interest in what's going to happen to an old man's estate. Either you show up or you don't. Either you're there in January or you aren't. My dad knows the difference. He's always known. I started the truck and pulled out onto George Street, and I drove home in the kind of quiet that only comes when something is finally, fully settled into place.